Welcome to Virtualize Everything. So tonight's presentation is going to be something that we've done a few times before. Well, 3 or 4 times before. But we've learned a lot since May when we did the last presentation. So we're going to walk through how to install Proxmox. Not just install Proxmox for this video, as we've done that, but I also want to take you through how to configure basic firewall, get your firewall up and running, how to download images for both containers, how to set up no subscription repository, or look at getting updates at least, and how to download container templates. Throughout this video, I'm going to try to provide chapter markers, so go ahead, look, and see what you can do with them if you need to skip a part. I will try to explain more about ZFS, but I don't know how much outside of the default install that somebody would be doing on their first Proxmox server I'm going to get. Okay, so here we are at Proxmox's install screen. This is the screen you get after you've configured your BIOS to boot from your USB drive and you've booted up. I'm not going to take you through the process of configuring your BIOS, as there are many different BIOSes that you need to configure. But usually, if you tap delete or F1, sometimes F12, during the boot up process rapidly, you should enter a boot configuration screen, or your BIOS screen where you can select a boot option in one of the many tabs to configure your system. So after you've done that, you're going to be presented with this screen. And we're going to use the arrow keys and the keyboard to mostly move around, although we will have access to the mouse. So we're going to highlight Install Proxmox VE and press Enter. So this screen here, if you get it, you may have a problem. You may have to go back in and configure your BIOS to allow virtualization, or you may have a CPU that doesn't support virtualization. I'm going to click OK today and continue on, as I'm virtualizing Proxmox, and I know that I won't be actually virtualizing much with this, and I also know that I'll be able to virtualize because my CPU does support it. So let's go ahead, click OK. Now we're presented with an ULA. Scroll through, read it, please. I know most people don't. Then click I agree. And now it's time to select your hard drives or your basic hard drive setup to install. If you were installing ZFS at this point, you'd click Options and do some configuration here with ZFS. You can also use ButterFS, but to my knowledge, ButterFS isn't fully supported and is only supported as a demonstration feature. That might be alright for us home lab guys playing it around with it, and maybe we want to try that out. But ZFS is fully supported along with ext4. Alright, so I'm just going to exit out because I'm going to do the normal configuration process because I only have one drive here. I also would like to note, for anybody thinking about setting up a ZFS RAID rather than using a RAID controller, ZFS, due to the nature of how it works, and it's great how it works, but it requires a lot of RAM. So if you're on a budget system with not a lot of RAM, think twice about using ZFS. So now we're going to hit Next, and we're going to enter our country and our time zone. And mine's New York. And then we're speaking US English. So next, enter your system password. And all we need to get past this email address is to change invalid to com. Now, take note, you may want to enter an email address later. There are ways of setting up Proxmox to notify you via email if things go wrong or events happen, and you may want to have had your email address in for that reason. We're going to hit Next. We can change our system name here. And if you're setting up a cluster or something like that, it might be important to have a unique system name. For me, it doesn't matter today. Now we're going to set our IP address and our information that's automatically configured via our DHCP server. So we can hit next, and we're going to press install. Okay, so when you're done installing, or after Proxmox is finished installing, it will automatically reboot. When Proxmox is rebooted, you'll get a screen that looks just like this, with your IP address right here for your system, followed by a colon and 8006. The colon denotes a port. You also want to notice that we're using HTTPS here. And this means that our web browser, when we try to do our first login, will actually experience a few problems. And we're going to have to tell it that it's okay to talk to this server. So in a minute here, I will be back, and let's log in to the web interface. All right, so welcome back. Now it's time to log into our web interface. So I've opened a web browser and I've entered HTTPS, the configured IP address of the server, and port 8006. And I get presented with this screen. Now this screen may be a little different if you're using Chrome, Safari, or even Microsoft Explorer, or Edge I think it's called these days. But it's all the same premise. It's warning you that the certificate, the root certificate, has not validated the certificate that the server is using to communicate, and the page might be bad. This is something we can fix later on by either setting up Let's Encrypt or setting up a certificate authority and applying our own root certificate to our browser. This is outside of the scope of this video, but it can be fixed later on if you so choose. Right now, we're going to hit Advanced, and we get another pop-down, and then we're going to hit Accept the Risk and Continue. Now, we're here at the login screen for our web interface for our newly configured Proxmox server. We can log in with root and the password we set up during the installation process. Okay, so now we've logged in to our web interface. The first thing I like to do after we've logged into our web interface is to set up our no subscription repository so we can begin receiving updates, since we're using a non-subscription or non-enterprise licensed version of Proxmox. Now, we actually get the updates faster with this particular configuration than we would with our enterprise subscription. But in getting them faster, we're actually testers, and we're testing out second generation updates for Proxmox. So this can cause problems, and it's heavily suggested by Proxmox not to use a no subscription database in the enterprise environment for any production Proxmox server. Okay, so with that being said, we go to the node, in our case we called it PVE, and then we come down under the Updates drop-down, we have repositories. The first thing we're going to do is get rid of this enterprise repository by highlighting it and pressing Disable. Then we're going to hit Add. We're going to say, okay, we understand that we don't have a valid subscription. And now we are given a drop-down for repositories we can add. The repository we're going to be adding right now is called No Subscription. And we can hit Add at this point, and it's added in right here. So now I like to hit Reload. I don't believe it's necessary, but it makes me feel better that it's gone in. So we can hit Updates at this point, and we still have no updates available for this server, but we can get them by clicking Refresh and OK. Okay, so now we should have a list of available updates, if there are available updates. So we can close this window, and there you go. There's our available updates. Now to install the updates, just like we would with Linux, we'd run apt upgrade. We can do that right from the web interface by hitting this upgrade button. It opens up a shell terminal and runs the command for us. It doesn't run the command with -y, so we need to select yes and press enter. I'll be back when the updates are finished installing. Okay, so at this point you can see that our updates are done installing. So we can go ahead and close out this shell window. And we can hit leave page. And refresh. And you can see that we no longer have updates to install. Now at any point, if you want to get back to the shell interface to do any work on the command line of this server, you can select the node and then select shell here. And this will bring you to the command line interface or the shell interface for this particular Proxmox node. Alright, so now that we've logged into the web interface and we've done our updates, the next thing I like to do is look at network configuration. Now, some of my peers talk about configuring the firewall next. Maybe not peers, but friends. Other fellow Proxmox users that I talk to on a fairly regular basis. But I disagree with them, and I disagree with them because if we don't have the network settings configured, it's kind of hard to configure firewall rules. We'll end up having to do one of these feedback loops where you configure the firewall rules, then you go to networking, then you go back to firewall rules. But with that being said, in most scenarios, at least in this level, where we haven't gotten containers or VMs running, and we don't really have any idea what's running or what will be running on this production server at the time, the firewall rules are fairly simple. So let's start by looking at networking, because that's where I like to start. So here's the networking tab, and it can be found by selecting the node, or PVE in our scenario here, and then selecting networking. Now, here is the one web interface, or Ethernet port rather, and you can see that it's active, and auto start's turned off, and that we don't have VLANs. Now, that doesn't mean we can't use VLANs on this port. It just means that it's not configured to be VLAN aware. Now, here's another port, and you can see that this port is actually off. Now down here, we have a Linux bridge, and this is called VMBR0. So what a bridge is it's kind of like a switch, and it's set up to handle traffic coming and going from the server for multiple VMs and containers, just like a switch would handle traffic from multiple different computers or Ethernet ports heading in different directions. And this switch is configured with an IP address and a gateway. So what this means is that this particular bridge can be identified from the server and used to communicate with the outside world. So it knows where its internet access is here with the gateway address and what its name is so that the router can know to communicate with it. We don't particularly need to configure an IP address on every bridge or on every other type of networking component, which if you need more information on, check out our video Linux Networking with Proxmox Web Interface for more information on each individual component that you need to use to set up more complex networking. We can also only set up one gateway address for one bridge or port or anything inside of Proxmox. And that is going to be the interface or Ethernet card or Ethernet port that Proxmox uses to communicate with the internet for things like updates and downloading container images and ISOs. I'll show you more about how to do that in a few minutes here in the video. So right now, this bridge is configured for communicating with Proxmox, the server, and you can see that we're actually using the same IP address here to communicate with it at this current time. And it's also our bridge for communicating with the internet. Now, if I wanted to use a different bridge, or maybe have Proxmox communicate on two different networks, I can actually select this port, and then I can go create Linux bridge. And again, we cover bonds and VLANs. Now this is fine if you're just needing or just have one port and want to just leave this default. You can. I'm just showing you how to set up another bridge because it's very common for management reasons that a system will have two bridges. So we can create a Linux bridge, and down here on bridge port, we're going to enter ENS19. Now, you may use different names like ETH or ENP I've seen for these ports, and that's all how Linux identifies the driver and the port number. Don't worry much about it, just know it's a network device. And for this particular bridge, we're not going to set up a IP address or a gateway. We're just going to create it. And now you can see that apply config has come up, and we can see the added lines to our configuration file. That's because the web interface is just a graphical way to edit a configuration file on the host Debian Linux system, the actual host operating system for Proxmox. So now we can just hit apply configuration and yes. And you can see that ENS19 has become active, and we now have another bridge that's active. Okay, so now that we've looked at firewall setup and network setup, let's look at how to add a drive. One of my favorite drives to add to Proxmox is called a directory drive. Now there's other options like ZFS or LVM or even thin LVM. But I find the directory drive, although it can be a little slower than LVM and thin LVM, to be a little bit more versatile. And I like that so that I don't have to have multiple configurations. So in order to add a directory drive, we're going to select the node, and then we're going to scroll down and we're going to select disks. Now you can see I've added 3 drives here, and we're going to choose SDC here. Now, the first thing we want to do is wipe the drive and click yes. Now that the drive's been wiped, we can initialize it. Now with the drive initialized, we can come down here, hit the drop down, and go to directory. Then we can click create directory, select the drive, choose the file system. I'm going to choose FSX and give it a name. And then hit create. Alright, now you can see that Proxmox has actually added a drive over here. And in just a second, we should be able to view the stats on the drive. There we go. And you can see that this drive is able to be used for backups, VM disks, container volumes, ISO images, container templates, snippets, and permission. So it's a very versatile drive for your Proxmox system. Now that we have the drive set up for our Proxmox system, let's look at actually getting a container and then a VM set up and installed on our Proxmox system so we can actually begin using Proxmox for what it's meant for, virtualization. So the first thing I'm going to start with is a container, and we're going to get a container image to start that process. So first we're going to click CT templates, and then you notice we have no templates here. So because we've gotten updates, we don't have to take any other step to update the container repository anymore. That changed after Proxmox version 7. So let's hit templates, and we have an up-to-date list because we've updated our repositories of all of the available templates. Now some some of these turnkey templates are pretty cool and you may want to look into using them. They offer pre-configured and pre-set up options like file servers, Nextcloud, OpenCloud, and a lot of others, as you can see. But what we're going to focus on today is actually some of the operating system templates that are available to Proxmox. And the one I'm going to use, although some of you don't like it, it's very popular in the server world and the Linux world, is Ubuntu 22.04. So in order to download that, we're going to click on the image so it turns blue, and then we're going to click download. Now, it's going to give you a status report running through. If you don't want to watch this status report until it finishes, you can hit X and continue on. And the operation is going to stay running down here. If you want to view it because you think it's taking too long or you want to see where it's at, you can just double click it and it'll open up. I'll be back when this is finished downloading. Okay, so it's finished downloading and we're ready to set up our first container. Let's exit it out, and then if we refresh here, we should see our new image has appeared. Now we can click Create CT, give it a name, and we're going to enter our password. This is important. This is the password we'll use to log in for the first time. Now, we're going to be creating an unprivileged container, and most of the containers you want to use are going to be unprivileged. Privileged containers allow a higher level of access to the host operating system's kernel, because containers are built and used on top of the kernel of your host operating system, in our case, Debian. So, with a higher permission level becomes a higher gradability of risk of escaping the container and being able to infect or manipulate the host operating system's server. So just keep that in mind. Now we're going to hit next and we're going to choose our template. Now we downloaded our template to drive 2. If we had downloaded it to local, it would be here on local, but ours is on drive 2. So then we select our template and move on. Now here's where we set the disk size. We're going to use 8 gigs here, but know that we can always resize this later on if we need to. So we're going to click next, choose our CPUs. We're going to use 1, but you may need to adjust accordingly to your plans. Same goes for memory and networking. Here, our default configuration is set to bridge 0. We may need to change that if we've set up other network bridges for other reasons. We're going to leave ours alone today for the VMBR 0. We can also configure VLANs and data limits if so needed. And you can also notice Firewall is checked, so it will be turned on by default from the configuration of this container. So we can choose to let our DHCP server set our IP address, or we can enter a static one. If you enter a static one, notice it stays red when I've entered the full IP address. That's because we actually need to add a / and the subnet mask, or CIDR. In most cases, that CIDR value will be 24 for most Class C networks. And then we need to enter the address to our gateway or our router. But in my case today, let's use DHCP. So check that. Next, DNS can be configured here if your DHCP's DNS is different, or if you have chosen to use a static IP address, DNS server will be provided from your host operating system. If you so choose to use a different one for another reason, this is where you configure it. Press next and finish. Now our container will be created. Okay, with our container finished creating, it's time to close this screen and start it for the first time. So we're going to again click on our container and it'll turn blue. Then we can press start. Now, if we want to view what our container is doing from our web interface, all we need to do is come over here and press console. Now, that's not the only way to view it. We can also view console here, but I find the window version just more comfortable to use. That's entirely up to you. So now that we have a login, we're going to enter the user ID of root and the password that we configured when we set up. Now you can always configure another user and set it up just like you would in Linux. In fact, I suggest that, as root users offer a large vulnerability and security risk. But that's for another tutorial. If you need to do that, check out our videos on doing just that, or some of the other great videos on setting up users on YouTube. So with that, we are now running and able to use our container inside of Proxmox. I'm going to go ahead, shut this container down, and then show you how to delete delete it from our Proxmox system. Okay, now with the container shut down, we can go ahead, if we want to delete it, of course, and click More and Remove. And now we can enter the container number. Our container number in this scenario is 101. Then, to remove all of the files from our drive, let's click Purge and Destroy. And now we'll click Remove. So Proxmox now has fully removed our container from itself. It is no longer there, usable, or in our way. I'll be back shortly to show you how to download an ISO image. Okay, so the first thing we need to do before installing a VM is get an ISO image. Getting an ISO image is very similar to getting a template image, with a few little nuances. So the first thing we want to do is select the drive where we're going to install it. Either our storage drive that we added, like we did in this tutorial, or local will work. We're going to use local this time so you can see the process working on a different drive. Select ISO images, and now we're going to use the download from URL feature this time. So click that. We're also going to want to check Advanced. Okay, so I've gone through Ubuntu's website and gotten to the point where the download would normally start. And then I stopped the download, as I didn't need it on the computer that I'm viewing Proxmox's web interface on. But they give you this download now link, which would restart it, or start it if it didn't start automatic. We're going to right click on that link and we're going to copy the link. Go back to our Proxmox server and paste it. Now hit Query URL, and that'll autofill the name that Proxmox uses for their installer ISO right there. Now head back to the Proxmox webpage and click on this Verify Your Download. Now, if we look here, we're going to use an SHA sum of 256. Go back to the web interface, hash algorithm, drop down, and we want the SHA 256 sum. Now, back to the web page, and let's copy the sum, and we're going to paste it here where it says checksum. Then hit download. I'll be back when this download's finished. Okay, so the download's finished, so we can close this screen out. Now we can see that we have the image here, and let's go ahead and click Create VM to start building our VM. Once again, you give your VM a name. Here, you can set it up to start automatically if you want. We're going to choose local and the Ubuntu image. We're going to leave all of this default here except for this QEMU agent. And I'll have more on that here in a few minutes. Next, we're going to choose and set up our hard drive. I'm going to leave it at 32 gig, and I'm going to set SATA. That's more preference for me. Now we're going to hit next and set up how many CPUs you want to use. 2 is usually a good number for Ubuntu desktop. Now we're going to choose 2 gigs of RAM, which is very light for Ubuntu desktop, but I don't have a lot of resources on this VM for this demonstration. So I'm going to stick to 2 gigs. Network, we're going to use VMBR0, which is our default bridge that was set up. If we wanted to, we could change it right here. And then let's confirm it and finish. Now, one thing I actually forgot to mention here, and I'm going to get there really fast, is under disk, if you have an SSD that you're going to be storing your image on, this disk card, if you have a trim supported operating system like Ubuntu or Windows or a few others, you want to check that. It's going to help make everything work correctly so you don't wear out your SSD as fast. Okay, so let's start this by pressing Start and Console, and it looks like we had a configuration error. So to start this, let's press Start, and you see the icon turns to green, and we can hit Console, and we're ready to start the installation process. We can press Enter. Now I'm going to do this installation process as I feel it's outside of the scope of this video. If you need a tutorial on installing Ubuntu, we have some on some older versions. Go ahead and check them out. I will be back when it's installed to show you some more stuff about setting up your VM. Okay, so we finally have Ubuntu installed. I ended up switching servers because the virtualization of the server and then the virtualization of Ubuntu inside the virtualized server was having some major performance hits, and it really wasn't a good demonstration for any of us for the performance of Proxmox. So with that, here's Ubuntu freshly installed. And the next thing I want to show you how to do is get what's called the QEMU guest agent installed. Now this agent is what allows us to communicate with Proxmox so that Proxmox knows the appropriate RAM usage as well as appropriate information for the host operating system or client operating system running on top of it. So to do that in most Debian-based operating systems is really quite easy. But we do need to go to the terminal. So here inside the terminal, the first thing we need to run is sudo apt update, because this is a fresh install and all the repositories aren't downloaded or up to date. Okay, I'll upgrade this later. But let's show you how to actually download the guest agent and install it and get it working, and then show you some of the feedback that's available from Proxmox once it's installed. Sudo apt install qemu guest agent, and I'll put -y at the end of it so it autos. Okay, so now we can go ahead and shut down Ubuntu or shut down the VM, and we can close our console window, and we should see our VM close out. Alright, so with our VM closed out, we can go to options and QEMU guest agent, hit edit, and we can enable this. Now, I did enable it as part of our installation for the VM, or our creation of the VM, if you remember. But I wanted to take the time to show you how to turn it on if you forgot and then decided you wanted to use it. So we can do that. Alright, so now let's go ahead, go back to summary for a second, and then hit start. Now we should be able to start up our VM again and view it by pressing console just like we did before. Okay, so Ubuntu's up and running. If we go back to our Proxmox terminal, you can see now our IP address is displayed along with a more accurate reading of RAM and CPU usage. This is because Proxmox now has the ability to communicate with the guest operating system and know its real stats and its real information it's using. So with this, we conclude our video about setting up Proxmox for the first time. I've taken you through the installation process, the configuration of networks, the configuration of firewalls, and the installation of both a container and a VM, as well as using the container template direct download feature and the ISO direct download feature. I hope you enjoyed tonight's video and found it very useful. Please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing for more videos in this series, as well as videos on home lab builds and videos on setting up different software that might be useful for you in your home lab. Have a good night.